Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm back with another video. I was reading an article by Larry Johnson on his blog, which is called Sonar 21. Larry is a long-term former employee. He was a former employee for, I think, over 20 years with the CIA, and he was responsible for some pretty high-level actions. I think he used to actually plan particular military actions, or he was involved in planning at a pretty high level. So he's quite professional, but he also has a very strong moral sense, I can tell. And at a certain point, he decided to leave the CIA, and now he's become what I would call one of the it's a kind of subculture of whistleblowers who have come from either the military or the intelligence agencies. So people that I count in that category would be people like Douglas McGregor, Colonel Douglas McGregor, or as I say, Larry Johnson, Ray McGovern, who used to give the Presidential Daily Briefing in his position in the CIA, Daniel Davis, and there's others people. There's also there's people like Jack Baud, who is I think he's a former Swiss military officer. So there are people who are in that realm who understand military affairs. Andrei Marchanov was a Soviet military officer, a naval officer. When the Soviet Union fell apart, he came to the United States because from what I could tell, his life was actually somewhat in danger because it was a virtual civil war going on inside of the former Soviet Union. So you have a kind of a category of people who have these military backgrounds. And you also have people like Max Blumenthal, who's just a regular independent journalist, and his wife, Anya Parampil, and Aaron Mate. So there's like a subculture of people who have really dug into the history of the current problems that we are facing. And so he wrote an article which I have listed below in the written part of this post, called Larry Johnson's the Sad State of U.S.-Based Russian Scholars. And I'm posting a comment that I made on Larry Johnson's excellent website, and you can see it further down, as I mentioned. But I wanted to go into this topic a little bit more thoroughly. Besides his article, which is in his article, he talks about a particular guy named Staniel Kotkin. And Staniel Kotkin makes some assertions that Larry Johnson says, just please, you don't know what the hell you're talking about. He laments the fact that there really is no significant basis of Russian or Soviet scholarship in academia nowadays. Steve Cohen was the last living, really great scholar of Russia, and although he wasn't pro-Soviet, but he at least had a reasonably objective viewpoint. Now, recently the name Robert Conquest came up because Robert Conquest was maybe the preeminent Soviet historian, but it turns out that he was not really an historian. He was actually an MI6 propagandist. So I'm going to talk about that also. So coincidentally, one of the greatest apparent students of the Joseph Goebbels, he was the Nazi propagandist who believed in the big lies. So the bigger the lie, the more likely that people are going to believe it. And so this guy Robert Conquest was a student of the Goebbels School of Black Propaganda in MI6. MI6 being the equivalent of the CIA in England, and so he was a purveyor of propaganda. He died in 2015 apparently, and there's another one named Tim Snyder. So along with the sources that I cite at the end of my comment to Johnson is Grover Four, who has spent much of his life as a Russian scholar. But he's outside of, he is an academic, but he's not in the accepted school of Russian academics. In other words, if you tell things the way they actually are, you won't have a career in American academia. So Professor Grover Four actually refutes Robert Conquest by using original archives. He went, Four speaks fluent Russian after the Soviet Union collapsed. He had access to the Soviet archives, and he was able to actually see, what actually went on. So he says that Robert Conquest has been identified as having worked for the IRD from when it was set up until 1956. The Information Research Department, IRD, was a section set up in 1947, originally called the Communist Information Bureau, whose main task was to combat communist influence throughout the world by planting stories among politicians, journalists, and others in a position to influence public opinion. In 1978, in The Guardian, that's the British newspaper, it alleged that Conquest's work there was to contribute to the so-called black history of the Soviet Union. In other words, fake stories put out as fact and distributed among journalists and others able to influence public opinion. After he had formally left the IRD, Conquest continued to write books suggested by the IRD with Secret Service, that is the British Secret Service, support. His book, The Great Terror, a basic anti-communist text on the subject of the power struggle that took place in the Soviet Union in 1973, was in fact a recompilation of text he had written when working for the Secret Services. The book was finished and published with the help of the IRD. A third of the publication run was bought by the Prager Press, normally associated with the publication of literature associated with CIA sources. Conquest's book was intended for presentation to useful fools, such as university professors and people working in the press, radio, and TV. Conquest remains to this day, for anti-communist historians, one of the most important sources of material on the Soviet Union. And there's a link to an article about Robert Conquest. The article from The Guardian in 1978 documents the propaganda activities of the IRD. David Lee wrote The Death of the Department That Never Was. This is The Guardian from January 27, 1978. And he said in 1980, this is Grover Four, interviewed Professor John Hazard of Columbia University, at the time the world expert on Soviet law. Hazard told me that people in the Soviet studies field had told him that British intelligence was still doing Conquest's research for him. By research, they mean fiction writing. Actually, that's my take on it. So Conquest, he says, he makes the astounding statement that truth can thus only percolate in the form of hearsay. And hearsay is not acceptable in court. And further, on political matters, basically the best, though not infallible, source is rumor. He believes that the best way to check rumors is to compare them with other rumors, a dubious procedure, given the fact that migrants read each other's works. Of course, historians do not accept hearsay and rumor as evidence in any other field of history. I might add that, I've referred to this passage in Buddhist texts where the Buddha says, he's asked by some villagers, how do I know what's going on? And the Buddha says, don't rely on hearsay or rumor. You have to go to the facts. So there was another a good academic named Arch Getty, and he wrote a book called The Great Purges Reconsidered, a dissertation from Boston College in 1979. These passages are also quoted in Getty, Origins of the Great Purges. The Soviet Communist Party reconsidered 1933 to 1938. This is a book that was published, I guess, by Cambridge University Press. And already in 1979, Getty concluded, the point of view adopted here is that the standard interpretations of the Great Purges, such as those by Feinsod and Conquest, are seriously flawed, cannot account for the available evidence, and are thus no longer tenable. Larry artfully demolishes academic Russophobes like Stephen Kotkin's studied deliberate ignorance in the above-cited article, to which I add my own comment here. So this is my comment. Kotkin is a product of Western neurotic Russophobia. In a Wikipedia quote from Kotkin in his biography of Stalin, there is this quote: Stalin was a student of Lenin and was, quote, an uncompromising class warrior with a complete lack of willingness to compromise with resolute ideological conviction. However, in my opinion, this sentence describes the entire U.S. political class, which has been screwing the middle class and working class for decades. When the modest campaign of Bernie Sanders offered reforms to help the vast majority of Americans, not only was Sanders illegally sabotaged, but the whistleblower who exposed this was murdered. U.S. politicians are fanatic, uncompromising class warriors. They're mercenaries for Wall Street, the military, and the Israel and other lobbies. And again quoting, with a complete, this is the American political class, not Stalin, with a complete lack of willingness to compromise with resolute ideological conviction. Nancy Pelosi herself bragged about the U.S. as capitalist while she was enriching herself through insider stock trading. I saw another of his quotes describing Stalin, which said that when Western government officials and politicians talk privately, they say one thing, but in public they say something quite different. But when Stalin spoke about class struggle, he said the same thing publicly as well as privately. In other words, he was not a two-faced, forked-tongued hypocrite like our politicians are. Now, I had seen that quote, and but I didn't have the actual quote available, so I contacted DeepSeek AI, which is what I often use for my research. And I asked them to track down the quote. Here's DeepSeek's response. Of course, this is a well-known and frequently cited observation from Professor Kotkin. You were thinking of a key passage from his biography, Stalin, Volume 1, Paradoxes of Power, 1978 to 1958. It's like the first 50 years of his life. The quote you're describing is not a single line, but a core argument that Kotkin makes about Stalin's political style and ideology. The most direct formulation of this idea appears in the introduction of that volume. Here is the most relevant passage. This is from Kotkin. For Stalin, there was no gap between ideology and realpolitik. Unlike a Western statesman for whom ideology might be a tool of public politics, to be discarded in private, for Stalin, ideology was the highest form of realpolitik. What he said in public was what he said in private. His published articles and speeches are a reliable guide to his thinking and actions. This is a quote from Stephen Kotkin's book. I'll add parenthetically that Hillary Clinton notably said that there was a public policy that she stated and a private policy. So she's admitting that she was a blankety-blank hypocrite and manipulator of public opinion while favoring her own class. So the context and your next steps. Kotkin makes this point to argue that historians should take Stalin's prolific published writing at face value. While many politicians have a public persona and a private, more cynical reality, like Hillary Clinton, Kotkin contends that Stalin genuinely believed Marxist-Leninist ideology provided the only correct scientific analysis of the world. Therefore, his public pronouncements were his private strategy. This is why studying Stalin's speeches and articles is so crucial to understanding his actions. So the quote you're tracking down, again, this is DeepSeek's response, is a central thesis of Kotkin's interpretation of Stalin, and the passage above is its clearest expression. Back to my comment. Yet Kotkin implies a criticism of Stalin. In the West, lying to the public is not merely normal, it's a part of the job description. So, what do modern Russians think? I just returned from Russia. I just literally returned from Russia like 3 days ago. And before I left, I had an amazing conversation with a Russian friend of mine. I've known him for several years. He's a really fine person, very, very intelligent, thoughtful guy. And these were his. So we talked for hours, and these were his main points about Stalin. Stalin brought Russia, a backward country, to be a world leader. It defeated the invasion of not just Germany, but other countries, Italy, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, Finland, in its coalition. Not to mention, this is me speaking, not to mention support by U.S. bankers and industrialists like Henry Ford, Prescott Ford of the Bush family, and future Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, and future CIA founding director Allen Dulles, both of whom, by the way, were directly working with or collaborating with the Nazis before, during, and after World War II. Russian leadership in space and the weapons which are winning against NATO, with a military budget 10 times Russia, are the result of the infrastructure that Stalin had planned. So basically, under Stalin, under Lenin and Stalin, there was not just a massive industrialization campaign and a massive industrialization of agriculture, which allowed productivity on the farms to increase so significantly that it could afford to have a large industrial economy, not just a backward agrarian economy. But it also dramatically improved the education of people. The literacy rate went from 20% at the time of the Russian Revolution to 90+%. And they became some of the great physicists and mathematicians and also great composers like Shostakovich and Prokofiev. So the Soviet Union was a really tremendous leap forward for human culture. One book I'd like to suggest was written by two Americans in 1946, with a foreword by then Senator Claude Pepper. But this book was written before the U.S. left. That is the real left, not the woke left, not the identity politics left, but the real left, which understood that class war is the fundamental issue. They wrote a book called The Great Conspiracy Against Russia, and in that book, which I've read, and I include a link to it, you can find it online. It's free. It talked about how what happened in the Russian Revolution, and it talked about a number of the challenges that the Soviet Union faced. So just to give you an example here, when the United States was forming itself in the revolution to kick the British colonial empire out of North America, so that there would be a United States of America free of British control. Guess which country was helping the colonies? It was the Russian Empire. And guess which country was protecting the United States from the British and the French during the Civil War? It was the Russian Empire, because the Russian Empire was not colonialist in the sense that the British, the French, the Belgians, and the Dutch were. They weren't going around Africa and South America and Southeast Asia, lying, cheating, and stealing and screwing these countries and stealing their resources. They stayed at home. And the other thing is that one of the big what do they say, tropes about Stalin was he killed millions of his people. Well, I think the Native Americans might have something to talk about when they're talking about where guilt lies for mass murder of indigenous populations. So this is just typical of the crass hypocrisy of the Western narrative about Russia and the Soviet Union, while totally overlooking its own crimes. It's really just, for me, it's personally appalling, and so that's why I'm bringing this article to your attention. So there's another source I'd like to bring to your attention. This is Franklin Delano Roosevelt's ambassador to Moscow during the 1930s was a Wall Street lawyer, no less. Had both a very positive view of both Stalin and the Soviet Union. There's a movie about it, and it's introduced by the ambassador itself. So, and it's called it is called Mission to Moscow. So, Kotkin and his ilk are responsible for many of the petty slanders against Russia when we could have made a better world by cooperating with Russia, which is what FDR wanted to do. And the reason why he was gotten rid of and why they put Harry Truman in his place to allow the Cold War to start, and the reason why they got rid of Henry Wallace, who also wanted to cooperate with the Soviet Union, was because the real owners of our country, they don't want that. They don't want cooperation. They want hegemony. They want imperialism. They want control. And they'll do anything they can, lie, cheat, and steal, just like Mike Pompeo says, to get it. So, in addition, paid academic Russophobe prostitutes, they're prostitutes for the press, like Robert Conquest, and Tim Snyder is another one, as well as former Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn, simply made stuff up. People say, Solzhenitsyn, he proves how bad the Soviet Union was. He made stuff up. His wife admitted that he made stuff up, and yet we gobble all that bullshit up because it fuels our preconceived notion of what Russia is and what the Soviet Union was. So just like the Tonkin Gulf incident was a lie, and Saddam's weapons of mass destruction was a lie, and Muammar Gaddafi handing Viagra out to his soldiers was a lie, and Assad's use of chemical weapons was a lie, the Western public has been subjected to decades of lies and psychological warfare to keep them in line, while their own standards of living sink at the expense of Wall Street and the war machine. My question is, when will the people finally get fed up to upend this system? For example, that thinks that the death of 500,000 Iraqi children due to illegal sanctions, as Madeleine Albright, who was the Secretary of State at the time, it was asked, do you think it's worth it? And the theft of numerous presidential elections in the United States, do you think it's worth it? The people who run the country, they think it's worth it. Do you think it's worth it? We can't bear this. So that's the reason why I'm making this post and why I have my website and this Substack, so that I can expose you to some of this information. You know, I go to the trouble of going to Russia. It's not cheap to do that, and what I went through is you saw in my previous post. It wasn't fun. You know, I've had other times which was a lot of fun, and when I have a chance to talk with my friend Kirill, you know, I have a wonderful time. But logistically, it was difficult. I mean, travel. It took me at least 24 hours of travel time just to get from where I live here in Thailand to Russia, or from Russia back to the United States, back to Thailand. So I hope you'll pay some attention to what I'm talking about here, and I'll just say, I'll finish off with one simple idea. We talk about Marx and talk about Lenin, and when I majored in German literature in college, and there was one famous German author of the 19th century that wasn't even a choice. It was Karl Marx, the most influential German writer of the 19th century, and they wouldn't even let us near his thought. But what I want to say is, you don't have to read Marx to know you're getting screwed. That's what our current economic system is. So just think about that, and that's all I have to say for now. So thanks for listening. Remember to please try and support my work if you can. I'm never going to charge for it because I feel that truth is priceless. But if you can help out, that would be great. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'll talk with you again soon.